The Whitmore estate rose from the cliffs like something carved out of the fog itself, a palace of stone and iron where silence reigned louder than any clock or bell. At dawn, mist rolled in from the ocean, seeping into every archway and curling around the marble pillars until the mansion seemed less like a home and more like a ghost that refused to die. Ivy climbed across its walls, crawling over windows that had not been opened in decades, and the iron gates at the entrance groaned like a warning to anyone who dared approach. Inside, every hallway gleamed, every surface polished, every antique in place. It was a world designed for order, and it pulsed to the rhythm of one man's will. Richard Whitmore lived here the way a general lives in a fortress. Each morning began with Colombian coffee brewed at precisely 6 o'clock. Each hour of his day was scheduled, his steps purposeful, his silence absolute. His fortune had been built not on charm, but on precision. Hotels that stretched across continents bore his name. Art hung in vaults under his command, and markets shifted when he placed a single call. But in his house, the empire shrank into discipline. Servants moved like shadows, trained to make no sound, to be invisible, to never disrupt the rhythm he had perfected. For Richard, emotions were interruptions, and interruptions were dangerous. Yet within this cage of marble and wealth, one presence did not entirely disappear. Emily Thompson carried her cleaning supplies the way a soldier carries his armor, shoulders bent, movements efficient, eyes downcast. Her sneakers were worn, her uniform simple, and her silence deliberate. She did not chatter with the others in the kitchen. She did not linger in doorways when conversations passed her by. She existed like furniture, useful, necessary, unseen. Years of the orphanage had taught her this art. Children who cried out were he punished. Those who stayed quiet survived. So Emily had made herself small. Still, there was something about her that could not be erased, though she herself didn't see it. The way her hand lingered on the edge of a crooked painting, straightening it as though it mattered. The way her eyes softened when she passed the grand piano in the drawing room, as if she could hear music no one else remembered. Richard Whitmore noticed. He never admitted it, not even to himself, but he saw the faint glow of something in her silence. Not defiance, not desperation, dignity. A quiet dignity that unsettled him more than he allowed. That morning, the estate had been still when his butler entered the study, a letter pressed carefully into his hand. The envelope bore the crest of the Golden Phoenix Foundation, embossed in gold, shimmering against the pale light of the stained glass windows. The charity ball was approaching, one of those glittering nights when the world's elite paraded themselves in silks and jewels, shaking hands that signed billion-dollar deals while violins played in the background. Attendance was not optional for Richard. His name carried weight, his absence would ignite whispers. He slid the letter open, scanning the formal invitation, and felt the weight of obligation settle over him like a chain. He would have to stand under chandeliers, smile when he did not feel like smiling, speak when he preferred silence. It was the same performance every year. Polished faces, hollow words, alliances stitched in champagne. He folded the letter back into its envelope with measured calm, but his jaw tightened. Down the corridor, he heard the faint rhythm of footsteps, steady, almost musical. Emily was polishing the brass handles of the east wing, her head bent in concentration, strands of hair falling from her knot. She did not know he was watching, yet something about our presence broke the monotony of his restlessness. He turned back toward the fire, the invitation still in his hand, and for the first time in years, Richard Whitmore wondered if order and silence were enough to carry him through what waited at the Golden Phoenix Ball. The mansion holding its breath as if the mist outside had seeped through the windows and into the very walls. Richard Whitmore stood in his study staring at the letter on his desk, the embossed crest of the Golden Phoenix catching the glow of the fire. It was not the first time he had been summoned to that annual parade of silk and vanity, but this year the weight of it pressed harder than usual. The idea of standing under chandeliers while pretending to be interested in hollow words filled him with an unusual kind of restlessness. His staff knew when not to disturb him, but fate is rarely patient. The sound of footsteps echoed lightly along the marble corridor. It was Emily Thompson, carrying a bucket of polish and a cloth, her uniform pressed, her eyes lowered. She moved without hesitation, like someone who had memorized the rhythm of invisibility. Richard watched her through the half-open door of the study. Her hand brushed against the edge of the table she was dusting, slow, deliberate, as though even lifeless wood deserved respect. A thought stirred in him, reckless and uninvited. His gaze shifted from the letter to the girl who had never once demanded to be seen. The mansion was full of staff who bowed and whispered and disappeared at his command. But she was different. She did not chase attention, and yet she carried it quietly, dangerously, as if she could rewrite the air simply by existing in it. Emily paused when she noticed him in the doorway, her spine straightened out of habit, her fingers curling tightly around the cloth. She expected correction, perhaps a criticism about the shine of the wood or the dust on the shelves, but instead he said something that made her breath falter. "Tomorrow night, you will attend the Golden Phoenix Ball. Why? With me?" Her lips parted, but no words came. She thought she had misheard. Attend the ball? With him? A maid among silk gowns and diamond necklaces? Her heart pounded so hard she feared he might hear it. "Sir, I think you mean someone else," she whispered. Richard's expression did not shift. "No one else. I mean you." The silence after his words pressed down heavier than the fog outside. Emily felt the walls close in. She thought of the stories whispered in the kitchen about cruel employers who set traps for their servants just to amuse themselves. She imagined herself in a room full of people who would laugh behind jeweled hands, tearing her apart with a glance. Her instinct screamed to refuse, to retreat back into the safety of silence. But she knew refusal was not an option. In the orphanage, those who said no were broken. On the estate, those who resisted were dismissed. She had nowhere else to go. Richard turned back toward his desk, his voice cold but certain. "Be ready at 7. Emily's throat burned with words she could not say. That she had nothing to wear. That she did not belong. That she would rather vanish than be paraded before strangers. Instead, she lowered her head and whispered, "Yes, sir." When she returned to her quarters that evening, she found a long box placed neatly across her bed. The lid opened with a whisper, and inside lay a gown the color of midnight, its fabric stitched with crystals that shimmered like constellations. Resting on top was a note written in his sharp cursive. "Wear this. No one can look away from what dares to be seen." Emily sat on the edge of the bed staring at the gown. It looked like a dream stitched into cloth, but dreams had never been safe for her. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the fabric. For the first time in years, she felt something she had forgotten was possible. Not safety, not certainty, but the frightening pull of bees. Scene. The quiet of Emily's small quarters where the gown lay draped across her bed like a secret too dangerous to touch. The walls of her room were bare stone softened only by a single chair and a narrow bed. Yet the midnight fabric shimmered as though it did not belong to this world at all. It looked more like something meant for the sky than for a maid who scrubbed brass handles until her hands burned red. She sat frozen before it, her fingers curled in her lap, her mind spiraling through 1,000 fears. What if this was a trap? What if Richard wanted to humiliate her before the very people who had always ignored her existence? What if tomorrow night ended with her shame etched into whispers that would never die? The note rested beside the gown, his handwriting sharp and deliberate. "Wear this. No one can look away from what dares to be seen." Emily read it again and again, unsure if it was a warning or a promise. She remembered the orphanage where silence was survival. The girls who shouted or cried were punished, while she had learned to fold herself into corners until she became invisible. Being unseen had been safety, and now she was being forced into the center of a storm. Her thoughts drifted back to the book she had clutched as a child, The Little Prince, its pages worn and edges torn. She used to whisper to herself that one day someone would notice her, that one day her voice would matter. But now that day had come, not as a dream, but as a command. She stood and walked to the mirror fixed crookedly on the wall. For a long moment, she stared at her reflection. The girl who looked back was pale, tired, her hair knotted loosely at the back of her head. She could not imagine that face beneath diamonds or chandeliers. She could only imagine laughter. That night she could not sleep. Every sound of the estate pressed louder against the silence. The ticking of the hall clock, the faint rustle of wind through the ivy outside, the footsteps of the guards on the gravel paths. Each sound reminded her of the inevitability of what awaited her. She tried to imagine refusing, but she could see the cold finality in Richard's eyes. There had been no room for negotiation, only certainty. He was a man who had built empires from discipline. He did not speak lightly. At midnight, she finally stood barefoot on the stone floor and approached the gown. The crystals caught the moonlight spilling through the narrow window, scattering it across the walls like broken stars. She reached out with trembling hands and lifted the dress from its box. The weight of it startled her. It was heavier than she expected, as if stitched with more than fabric, as if stitched with destiny. She held it against her body, staring into the mirror. For an instant, she did not see the orphan or the maid. She saw someone else. Someone who could walk into a ballroom without bowing her head. Someone who could silence the whispers, not with power, but with presence. Her throat tightened and she whispered to the empty room, "I am not ready." But the reflection in the mirror did not look away. The gown shimmered against her skin like a challenge she could not escape. Tomorrow she would descend into a world that had always closed its doors to her. Tomorrow she would either be destroyed or reborn. And somewhere in the vast estate, Richard Whitmore sat in his study, staring into the dying fire, the invitation to the Golden Phoenix Ball unopened on his desk, knowing the moment he had set into motion would change everything for them both. Beneath the golden light of chandeliers that swayed softly in the night breeze, as if even the mansion itself knew something was about to change. The estate was alive in a way Emily had never seen before. Black cars with tinted windows glided up the long stone driveway, headlights slicing through the fog. The butler moved briskly through the halls, his expression unreadable. Staff whispered nervously in the kitchens, and somewhere near the grand staircase, the orchestra was already tuning their strings. This was not an ordinary evening. This was the Golden Phoenix Ball, and every powerful eye in the city was waiting. Emily stood before the mirror in her small quarters, the midnight gown draped over her frame like a spell she did not know how to break. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the delicate fabric, the crystals catching the candlelight and scattering it across the walls like fragments of a star. Her hair, usually tied back in a knot, now fell in soft waves down her shoulders, framing her face in a way she barely recognized. She hardly knew the woman staring back at her. The maid was gone. In her place stood someone fragile yet unyielding, someone the world had no right to ignore. Her chest ached with every breath as she thought of what awaited her. The ballroom filled with silk gowns, polished shoes, and the sharp gaze of those who had lived their lives wielding power like a weapon. She imagined their whispers tearing at her dress like claws, imagined the cold laughter that would follow. She wanted to tear the gown off and hide in the safety of the shadows, but her fate had already been sealed the moment Richard Whitmore had spoken those words. "Be ready at 7. A knock at her door pulled her from her spiraling thoughts. The butler's voice was calm but carried no softness. "Mr. Whitmore is waiting." Emily's heart thundered against her ribs as she stepped into the corridor. The marble floor echoed beneath her heels as if announcing each step louder than the last. She passed portraits of long-dead Whitmores, their stern faces watching her with silent judgment. By the time she reached the grand staircase, her breath was shallow, her hands cold. At the base of the staircase stood Richard Whitmore, clad in a tailored black tuxedo that made his presence sharper than steel. His posture was straight, his expression unreadable, but when he turned and saw her, something flickered in his eyes. For a fleeting moment, the man who had built empires and silenced boardrooms stood speechless. His gaze swept over her, not with hunger or pity, but with something far more dangerous. Recognition. Emily froze at the top of the stairs, her fingers tightening against the railing. Every instinct told her to turn and run, but his voice reached her, low and steady. "You look like yourself. Finally." He extended his arm toward her, the gesture both command and invitation. Her legs trembled as she descended, every step heavier than the last. The murmurs from the guests already waiting in the foyer began before she even reached the floor. Who is she? Where did she come from? What is Richard Whitmore doing with a stranger? When she reached the bottom, Richard offered his arm again. Shall we? His words were calm, but his eyes were burning with something she could not name. She placed her hand lightly against his sleeve. Together they stepped through the towering doors into the waiting black car that would take them to the hotel where the Golden Phoenix Ball was already glittering with light. Neither spoke during the ride, but the silence between them was alive, charged with tension, like a storm gathering on the horizon. When they arrived, the hotel blazed like a palace, its entrance lined with photographers, its halls spilling with the sound of violins. Artie stepped out first, commanding the night with his presence. Then Emily followed, her gown catching the light as gasps rippled through the crowd. Whispers ignited instantly, racing through the guests. Like fire. Some leaned forward, others recoiled, but no one looked away. Richard Whitmore's maid had just stepped into a world designed to destroy her, and the battle had only just begun. The golden doors of the ballroom opening wide as Richard Whitmore and Emily stepped into a sea of glittering faces and polished diamonds. The chandeliers spilled light over marble floors, violins played a slow waltz, and every guest who had come to exchange power through handshakes and champagne suddenly froze. For years, the Golden Phoenix Ball had been predictable, a parade of wealth and legacy, but tonight the rhythm faltered the moment Emily descended the staircase at Richard's side. She kept her chin high, though her heart pounded so fiercely she thought the fabric of her gown might tremble with it. Whispers moved through the crowd like serpents, slick and cutting. Some gasped in awe, others sneered behind jeweled fingers. She could feel their eyes crawling over her skin, weighing her, dissecting her, trying to decide whether she was an heiress in disguise or a mistake that had somehow slipped past the gilded doors. Richard did not falter. He walked with the same composure he carried into boardrooms, his arm steady beneath her trembling hand. When they reached the center of the room, the orchestra shifted into a waltz, and without asking, he turned to her, his hand extended. "Dance with me." Her throat tightened. She had never waltzed in her life, never set foot on polished floors meant for royalty. For a heartbeat, she thought of refusing, but his gaze left no space for retreat. Slowly, she placed her hand in his, and the music carried them forward. Her first steps were hesitant, clumsy, her heel brushing against the hem of her gown. She braced for his correction, for a flash of irritation, but it never came. Instead, his movements guided hers gently, firmly, until her rhythm matched his. Around them, the ballroom grew quieter. The powerful and the privileged leaned forward, drawn into a dance they had not expected to witness. But the silence was not kind. Near the bar, a woman's voice dripped with venom. She must be an actress paid to amuse him. Another hissed, "She's a novelty. He'll grow tired of her in a week." A man laughed softly. "Or maybe a maid playing princess for the night." Emily heard every word, though her face betrayed nothing. She kept moving, her body remembering the beat even as her spirit wavered. When the music ended, there was no applause, only stunned silence. And then from the far corner of the room, a woman in crimson began to move. Madison Holay. Her gown clung like fire, her champagne flute balanced easily between painted nails. She was beautiful, poised, and dangerous, a woman who had once stood at Richard's side and believed no one could ever replace her. Emily felt the air shift as Madison approached. The crowd parted for her like the sea, whispers following in her wake. She stopped just close enough for her words to cut, but not loud enough for everyone to hear. "So this is the surprise Richard brought us." Her tone was sweet, her smile sharp. A girl no one knows in a dress that does not belong to her. Emily's stomach nodded, but she did not look away. Madison's gaze swept over her like a blade. He always did, like lost causes. The words were laced with poison, but Emily's silence held. She had survived sharper cruelty than this. Nights in the orphanage where taunts had cut deeper than knives. She met Madison's eyes, steady and unblinking, and for the first time the woman in crimson faltered. Richard's voice broke the moment, cool and decisive. "Madison." His tone was polite but final, a dismissal cloaked as acknowledgement. The music swelled again and the crowd shifted back into its dance, but Emily knew the encounter had left a mark. Madison would not forget the way her presence had unsettled the room, and neither would Emily, who realized for the first time that her silence could be stronger than their noise. Emily slipping through a side door, her breath uneven, the noise of the ballroom clinging to her like smoke. The air on the balcony was cooler, the city lights stretching endlessly below, a field of gold scattered against the darkness. She gripped the stone railing with trembling fingers, trying to steady the storm in her chest. Inside, laughter rose like a blade sharpened on crystal, every whispered insult chasing her even out into the night. She told herself she was only catching her breath, but deep down she knew she was escaping. The glass door clicked open behind her. Soft steps followed, heels striking with intent. Emily turned and saw Madison framed in the glow of the chandeliers, her crimson dress flickering like fire against the night. She carried herself with the certainty of a predator who had cornered its prey. Her smile was polished, but her eyes burned with challenge. "So here you are." Madison's voice was smooth but edged like broken glass. "Hiding on the balcony while the rest of us pretend you belong inside." Emily stood straighter, though her heart beat fast. "I only needed air." Madison tilted her head, circling closer. "Air is for those who can breathe this world without choking. You are not one of them. Do you know what they're saying about you in there? You're a distraction, a novelty, his latest amusement. And when he grows tired of you, you'll vanish back into the shadows where you belong." The words struck like knives, but Emily did not flinch. She had been invisible for so long that cruelty no longer startled her. Instead, she spoke with a calm she did not recognize as her own. "I have seen people like you before." Madison's smile wavered. "Have you?" At the orphanage, Emily continued, there were donors who visited once a year. They brought cameras and promises they never kept. We used to count how many seconds it took before they forgot our names. The sigh, length that followed was sharp. For a moment, Madison's eyes flickered, a crack in the perfect mask, before she smoothed it back into a smile. "Revenge, then." "That's what this is." "No," Emily said firmly. "This is presence." The words hung heavy in the night air. Madison's lips curved, but the smile no longer reached her eyes. "You are not staying," she whispered. "This is a moment, not a place." Emily stepped closer, her voice steady. "Maybe, but this moment is mine, and you'll remember it." Before Madison could respond, another voice joined them. A woman stepped out onto the balcony, tall and commanding in a navy gown, silver hair swept elegantly from her face. Elizabeth Monroe, philanthropist, investor, a woman whose name carried the weight of nations. She looked at Madison first, her expression cool. "Always the gatekeeper," she said dryly. Then she turned her eyes to Emily, and something shifted in her gaze. "You walked into a room that is terrified of you," Elizabeth said quietly, "because you did not come through the front door like they did. And still, you outshone them." Emily blinked, caught off guard. "I'm not trying to outshine anyone." "That's why it worked," Elizabeth replied. For the first time since she had stepped into the ballroom, Emily felt a thread of something stronger than fear. Validation. Madison's smile tightened as if the ground beneath her had tilted. She brushed past both women with a final flick of crimson silk. "Enjoy your moment," she whispered. "It won't last." When she was gone, the balcony was quiet again, except for the hum of the city far below. Elizabeth placed a hand lightly on the railing beside Emily. "You don't know it yet," she said, "but tonight you already made history." Emily looked down at her trembling hands. She had not expected kindness. She had not expected to survive the confrontation. But as she stood in the night air with Elizabeth Monroe's words echoing in her mind, she realized something dangerous. For the first time in her life, silence was no longer her shield. It was her weapon. The quieter wing of the hotel, where the noise of the ballroom dulled into a distant hum. Emily had slipped away again, needing space after the confrontation on the balcony. her chest still burning from Madison's venom and Elizabeth's unexpected kindness. The ornate corridors stretched endlessly, their walls lined with gilded frames and stormy paintings that seemed to watch her with knowing eyes. She thought she was alone until she noticed a man at the far end, dressed in a server's uniform, carefully balancing a tray of empty glasses. His movements were deliberate but heavy, like someone carrying more years than his body could hold. At first, she did not recognize him. His silver hair caught the low light, his posture stooped with exhaustion, and his limp made each step uneven. But when he turned his face toward her, she froze. There was a kindness in his tired eyes that struck her like a memory long buried. The glass on his tray trembled and his lips parted. "Emily," he whispered, almost as if he was afraid to believe it. Her heart stumbled. She blinked, startled. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" He lowered the tray onto a nearby table, his hands shaking. "It's me," he said softly. "Mr. Langley from Fifth Avenue Orphanage." The name shattered her like lightning. Years collapsed in a single instant. She saw peeling paint on orphanage walls, cots lined up by a rattling radiator, and her small hands clutching a book with a fox on the cover. She remembered crying quietly under the stairs so no one could hear, and the steady presence of a man who never raised his voice, who offered her silence as comfort instead of punishment. Mr. Langley. Emily breathed her throat tight. He smiled, though his eyes glistened. "You used to sit under the stairwell with the little prince, reading it aloud when you thought no one was listening. You told me once the stars felt closer when it rained." Tears stung her eyes. "I haven't thought about that in years." "I never forgot you," he said. "You were different, always watching the world with questions in your eyes." Her hands trembled. "I thought you left." "I was let go," he said simply. "They said I was too slow, too soft. Funding cuts. But I knew you would make it out someday. I just never imagined like this." He glanced toward her gown with a quiet pride that made her throat ache. She tried to laugh, but it broke into a sob she quickly swallowed. None of this was planned. "Life rarely is, Emily," he replied. He reached into his pocket then and pulled out something worn, its edges frayed, its cover creased. She gasped when she saw it. The Little Prince. Her name was still scrawled inside in clumsy, childish letters. "I found it in the donation bin after you left," he said gently. "I thought you might want it back one day." Emily held it to her chest, the weight of memory overwhelming. "I used to pretend I was the fox," she whispered, waiting for someone to notice me. "But maybe I was the rose all along." He smiled quietly. "And look how you've bloomed." For a moment, the ballroom noise vanished, the glitter and cruelty erased. All that remained was the fragile truth of a girl who had once been invisible and the man who had seen her even then. But the moment fractured with a sharp sound. A flash sparked from the shadows. A camera. Emily turned quickly, but the photographer was already gone, vanishing into the corridor before she could see his face. Her heart raced, fear gripping her chest. Someone was watching. Someone had captured the most vulnerable piece of her life. Mr. Langley placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Are you all right?" She swallowed hard. "I don't know. Someone's following me." He squeezed her hand gently. "Let them. You've already survived worse." She nodded, though the unease burned in her veins. When she returned toward the bellows, room clutching the book tightly in her hands, she felt the ground shift beneath her. A secret part of her past had been exposed and turned into someone else's weapon. And yet she did not hide it. She held the book where everyone could see. Richard was waiting near the edge of the crowd, his eyes locking onto hers the instant she stepped back into the golden glow. He saw the book. He saw the tears she refused to shed. And for the first time, his expression was not cold or distant. It was proud. But in the far corner of the room, a journalist pressed his phone to his ear. "Yes, her name is Emily Thompson," he murmured. "Former orphan maid at the Whitmore estate. No background, No legacy. Exactly. It's the perfect scandal. And I have the photo. The clock had begun ticking. The world outside the ballroom was already sharpening its knives, a shift in the atmosphere so sharp that even the music seemed to hesitate. The orchestra played on, the chandeliers glittered, and guests raised their crystal glasses. But beneath the polish there was a crack in the room, a tension that spread like smoke. Emily stood near the roses, clutching the little prince to her chest, her breath shallow. She had survived Madison's venom, survived the whispers, even survived the haunting collision with her past, but the camera flash still echoed in her mind like a gunshot. Somewhere in the city, someone was already writing her downfall. She thought she could slip back into the shadows unnoticed, but that night was no longer hers to escape. The master of ceremonies stepped away from the stage as Richard Whitmore rose from his place at the table. His presence alone pulled the attention of the room. Conversations stopped, glasses stilled. Even the music softened as if bowing to him. Richard rarely spoke at these events. He preferred deals sealed in silence, power built in shadows. That was why the guests leaned forward with such hunger when he mounted the platform. He carried no notes, no polished speech, just his own voice, steady as iron. "Many of you have asked me tonight," he began, "who she is." A ripple passed through the ballroom. Eyes turned to Emily, piercing, unrelenting. Her knees trembled, but she did not lower her gaze. He continued, his eyes never leaving hers, is not a mystery, not a rumor, not an ornament to anyone's story. She is someone the world trained to disappear, someone who worked in silence so others could shine, someone who chose dignity when the world offered her invisibility. Gasps stirred the air. A senator's wife clutched her pearls. A young model whispered too loudly, "She's a maid." The word hissed like poison, but Richard's voice cut through it with thunder wrapped in velvet. "You call her a maid as if it means less," he said. "I call her Emily Thompson, and she is the only person I wished to bring tonight because she reminds me of something this room has forgotten. Worth does not come from legacy. It comes from survival." Emily's throat tightened. The weight of his words pressed on her, not as a burden, but as recognition. He was tearing down the walls of the ballroom with nothing but truth. Richard stepped down from the platform and walked across the marble floor. The crowd parted as he passed, whispers trailing in his wake. He stopped in front of Emily, his eyes softer than she had ever seen. He did not reach for her hand or her waist. He reached for the worn book she held against her chest. He lifted it into the light. "This," he said, "is not just a book. It is a story carried by a girl who once read under stairwells, who scrubbed floors while others stepped over her, who was invisible because the world told her to be. But tonight, she stands here because she chose not to disappear." Silence held the room in its fist. Then a single clap broke it. Elizabeth Monroe. Her hands deliberate, eyes unwavering. Others followed, hesitant at first, then louder, until applause erupted like thunder rolling through the hall. Emily stood frozen, her heart torn between fear and something dangerously close to hope. She had not asked for this stage, had not sought it, yet the room was now alive with her name. She turned her face toward Richard and saw not a savior, not a master, but a man who had risked his own reputation to place her in the light. But across the room, the journalist who had spoken into the phone earlier smiled to himself. His headline was already forming. To him, this was not a victory. It was the perfect scandal dressed as a fairy tale. And as the applause raged on, Emily felt the weight of it. She was no longer invisible. She was a storm the world would either embrace or try to destroy. The master of ceremonies stepping back onto the stage, his polished shoes glinting under the chandelier light. The applause for Richard's declaration was still echoing through the ballroom when he raised the microphone again, his smile practiced, but his voice trembling with something new. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we close tonight, there is one more voice you must hear." The air shifted like the room itself had inhaled. "Emily Thompson, would you join us?" Emily froze. Her pulse pounded so hard the book in her hands shook. She wanted to melt into the marble floor, vanish into the shadows where no one could reach her. but every eye in the room turned toward her, the weight of expectation pressing her lungs tight. She had not been prepared for this. No speech, no script, no armor, only herself. Slowly she moved forward, each step a storm inside her. She felt the whispers buzzing like bees, but the silence was louder. When she reached the stage, the spotlight cut across her face. The microphone weighted like a blade. She took it with hands that trembled, but her voice when it came was steady. "I was never meant to be here," she said. "Not in this gown, not in this room, not under this light." A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through the crowd, but she pressed on. "I grew up in a place where silence was survival, where the loudest child was punished first, where dreams were things you hid in books, because reality had no space for them." She lifted The Little Prince, the frayed cover trembling in her hand. "This was my first treasure. I found it in a box when I was 7. It told me that what matters most is invisible. Kindness, dignity, the courage to keep going when no one sees you." Her eyes swept the crowd steady now. I scrubbed floors while people stepped over me. I folded sheets in silence while others laughed 2 doors down. I existed in the corner of power, but never inside it. Until tonight. The room was so still that even the violins had stopped mid-note. She felt her voice grow stronger, not because she had rehearsed, but because she had carried these words for years locked in her chest. "Tonight I stood in the center of your ballroom, and for the first time I did not feel like I was surviving. I felt like I was becoming." Gasps rippled, some eyes glistened, some narrowed. She pressed forward. "Tomorrow you may call me a headline or a mistake, or forget me altogether, but I know what I am. I am not a prop. I am not a novelty. I am the result of every no that did not break me, of every day I rose again without applause. And maybe, just maybe, that is a story worth hearing." The silence cracked. First, Elizabeth Monroe rose to her feet, clapping with deliberate force. Then others followed. Senators, businessmen, wives in gowns. Until the entire ballroom was standing, the sound of their hands crashing like thunder. Not for Richard, not for spectacle, but for her. Emily set the microphone down and walked off the stage, her heart racing, her body light as air. She passed rows of people who stared not at her gown but at her face as if they were seeing her for the first time. And across the room Richard stood motionless, his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on her, not with pride but with awe. But behind the applause in the corner near the velvet curtains, the journalist slipped out of the room, his phone already buzzing. He had her name, her past, her photograph. Tomorrow morning the world would not only celebrate her, it would try to tear her apart. The dawn breaking over Manhattan, the city stirring awake as headlines scattered across breakfast tables, phones, and televisions. By 7 o'clock, Emily's name was everywhere, from maid to mystery guest, from orphan to the voice that silenced the Golden Phoenix Ball. Photographs of her in the midnight gown flooded the internet, some capturing the moment she descended the staircase, others freezing her on stage with the worn copy of The Little Prince in her hands. Hashtags spread like wildfire, but not all were kind. Praise collided with poison. Some called her a symbol, others a scandal. And in the corner of every newsstand was the sharp headline of the journalist who had slipped out the night before. Maid of the Whitmore estate, ex-orphan exposed. Emily sat in the back of a black car staring at her phone as it vibrated with hundreds of messages, interview requests, invitations, endorsements, demands. She switched it off her fingers, trembling. "I never asked for this," she whispered to the glass. Across from her, Richard sat in silence, his eyes unreadable. "You didn't ask for it," he said finally, "but you earned it." Her throat ached. "They'll destroy me. They'll twist it until I am nothing but a headline." He leaned forward, his voice low. "Then let me tell you something they don't know. Something I should have told you before all this." The car slowed at the gates of the Whitmore estate, but he told the driver to wait. He turned to her, his expression stripped of its usual armor. "I wasn't born into this, Emily. I wasn't groomed in mansions or schools of marble. When I was 15, I slept behind a laundromat. I stole bread from a gas station once because I was starving. The owner caught me. He didn't call the police. He handed it to me and said, Pay me back when you can, and pay it forward when you're able." Emily's eyes widened. Her breath caught. He nodded. "That man saved me with mercy. I shed windows on university buildings until my hands bled. I built everything from scraps and silence. And the first time a banker shook my hand, he looked at me the way they looked at you last night, as if I was not meant to exist in his world." The car was silent, except for her heartbeat. Richard's voice softened. "I saw you humming in the East Corridor, polishing silver as if it mattered. You reminded me of that boy behind the glass, invisible, worthless in their eyes. I brought you to that ball not as a spectacle, but because I knew if the world saw what I saw, it would never forget you." Tears slipped down Emily's cheeks. For the first time, she understood that he had not forced her into humiliation, but into revelation. Not as his servant, but as his mirror. Back at the estate, the staff whispered as she walked past, no longer a shadow but a figure the entire world was speaking of. She returned to her small room and placed the gown carefully across the chair, the book resting beside it. She opened its pages where a line was underlined in faded ink. "You become responsible forever for what you have tamed." She closed it and whispered, "I am not tamed. I am becoming." Weeks later, the first gathering took place, not in a ballroom, but in a school gymnasium in Queens. Folding chairs and chipped paint, no chandeliers, no diamonds, only rows of girls with tired eyes who had lived lives of silence. Emily stood before them, no microphone, no gown, only herself. She told them about the girl who scrubbed floors, about the night she walked into the Golden Phoenix Ball and refused to disappear. She ended with words that carried further than she could imagine. "You do not need to be saved. You need to be seen. And I see you." The movement was born that night. Voice from the shadows spread from city to city until murals appeared in alleys and stations showing the silhouette of a girl on a staircase holding a book to her chest with the words, "We were never voiceless, just unheard." Richard remained near her, not as a master but as an ally, watching the world shift around her. He opened doors she could walk through but never stepped ahead of her. And one evening, on the terrace overlooking the mist, he said quietly, "There are empires built of stone, and there are empires built of broken pieces. You are teaching me the second is stronger." Emily smiled faintly, her eyes on the horizon. "I was never supposed to be in their world," she said, "but maybe I was always supposed to change it." And as the fog rolled over the cliffs and the mansion loomed behind them, no longer a cage, but a fortress of memory, Emily knew the truth. She had not been forced into the ball. She had been forced into herself. And in becoming visible, she had given thousands of others permission to step out of the shadows too. The maid, the orphan, the invisible girl was gone. What remained was a woman whose voice had already begun to reshape the world.